Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies Podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Shannon Gleeson.
un placer de conocerte, Shannon. Nice to meet you.
Un placer también, gracias.
And I've got a standard question for cada invitada, invitado, which is to inquire what's currently dynamizing, preoccupying, interesting, impeding you.
Mhm. Yeah, well, thank you again for having me here. It's interesting moments that we're living in, and I think that in many ways I've looked to two sets of colleagues to kind of help guide me. One is the historic set of folks doing historical work, and the other is a set of folks doing comparative work, especially in Latin America. And I am neither. I'm a presentist that is focused on the United States with some work in Mexico. But I think kind of thinking beyond my disciplinary boundaries has been helpful. I think also thinking beyond the academy has been helpful for me. Academic institutions are under significant threat as we stand. And I think while see it as my professional obligation to my vocation to obviously stand with colleagues and students who are under attack, I also um, I think gain my energy and my sense of inspiration from community spaces where I'm learning from others and where I'm not necessarily the designated expert and where I will never pretend to be. And so I think being in spaces that kind of pull me outside of the hierarchies of academia are, I think, crucially important to the current moment.
And in fact, an important part of your work has been civil society, the third sector, NGOs, social movements as places of learning, but also of action. Is that fair to
Mhm.
say?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a kind of a split set of roles that are obviously connected. There's me, Shannon Gleeson, the researcher of civil society, of state society relations, of social movements, including but not limited to the labor and immigrant rights movement. But there's also me, Shannon Gleeson, the Ithaca resident, the daughter of immigrants, the community member who has an obligation to stand with and alongside migrants. And so my kind of relationship to these institutions obviously is often split. And so um, I, I I think that part of what I do on my day to day is to kind of decide at what point I can use power and privilege, but also a sense of curiosity and learning. And so sometimes it's appropriate for me to be in one or the other.
Yes. Sure.
Um, yeah.
And can I ask you a question about immigration? I'm a multiple immigrant, and
Hmm.
I currently can't get work in any of the countries where I'm a citizen, but
Hmm.
luckily I can get work where I am in Mexico. And the United States, at some level, advertises itself as being a nation of immigrants. There are all these people who say things like, I'm Irish, I'm Greek, I'm Italian, who've never been to those countries and can't speak those languages, but still identify that way and are
Hmm.
tribunes for this notion. On the other
Hmm.
hand, there is this backlash against migration that we've seen for decades, if not forever. Now, I know you're, as you called yourself, a presentist, which used to
Hmm.
be a swear word on the left. Being guilty of
Hmm.
presentism is very, very naughty, but you
Hmm.
embrace it. But
Hmm.
I wonder if you could tease out for me what are some of the explanations or how I might make sense of being told this is a nation of immigrants or I'm Irish or I'm Greek at the same time as there is this obsession with attacking difference.
Yeah, and I guess to start by contextualizing my position as a presentist, I think I do that as a tip of the hat to my colleagues who are doing the very careful work of history, of archival work. I think that it's so easy to kind of Google like what happened in this year, or everyone's a pop historian, but being in a super interdisciplinary space, I've been trained to take the historical archive seriously and to question it, right? Um, the running joke always is like how much time I don't spend in the stacks in the libraries, and that's kind of the my biggest shame. But yeah, I think, I write and I teach a lot about this ethos of a nation of immigrants, which is not uniquely American, but it is, I think, something that's really important to the kind of revisionist histories that we tell ourselves. And I think that one of the reason this is so powerful to the United States in particular, and Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz writes about this, is precisely because it helps us retell a story not only about the founding of a nation and what is often retold as this empty space called the Americas. And it's a way also to repudiate our histories of enslavement and genocide of Native American people. So I think that's one reason this is so
Mm,
telling.
mm,
So the nation of immigrants mythos is as a way to kind of repudiate these other pieces. And it's also, I think, used as a way to distance ourselves from the racist and xenophobic undertones of the current moment, such that we can start to distinguish between folks who, quote unquote, got in line the right way or who assimilated and learned the language, did all the things that good immigrants do. So it provides us a very immediate backdrop. Authors in my discipline, sociology, have often written about this idea of symbolic ethnicity and the ways in which the kind of cultural preservation of immigration waves from before get used in these kind of very particular ways, also to elide whiteness as kind of a central operating principle in the United States specifically. And so I think that it's part of a selective set of conversations we're having in this country, and even in terms of the public school system, and you see these battles being fought certainly at the level of the curriculum in K through 12 schools in the United States, but obviously right now in the current moment, conversations about what we can teach in university spaces. Last year, we had a long set of conversations about this, even the ability to talk about settler colonialism as a discipline, but also as a university, and whether that had inherent exclusionary undertones. And I think that that's precisely the point, is how we think about broader systems is not unique to the United States. And certainly the idea of settler colonialism becomes really important in terms of how we retell the story of immigration to the United States. And as I tell my students, the importance of studying immigration isn't specific to immigration, but it's important to understand it as a foil for so many of the other conversations we are having. Because as we start to ask questions of exclusion, so who do we draw that bright line of allowable or not allowable, desirable, undesirable, assimilable, non-assimilable, we're also redefining who we think we are as a nation, and that plays out in many more policy contexts beyond just immigration policy.
absolutely. And I think the evisceration of Native Americans and African Americans from the "We Are a Nation of Immigrants" story is very powerful because, of course, some of them, in one sense, were immigrants from Mexico or from Nueva España or whatever it might have been called. And some also, were immigrants, but involuntary ones, enslaved ones. And that
Mhm.
story is lost. I'm very interested in one particular phenomenon, which is the bourgeois Latino business person who voted for Trump and appears to be gung ho on at least some of the things being done by the current administration against people without papers. Now, that may be
Mhm.
exaggerated and it may be changing, but it seems to have been some sort of phenomenon. Where does that sit with you? Does that make sense empirically? And how would you understand it conceptually?
Yeah. So I'm not a political scientist, so I can't speak to this work, but I would commend to folks the work of political scientists like Matt Barreto at Latino Policy Decisions, who kind of looks at the empirical data on this. But I would maybe revise what you said a little bit,
Mm.
which is to say it's not simply the bourgeois Latina Latinos, it's the bourgeois aspirational Latina Latinos. It's those who see themselves as as with the case of the blue collar workforce, I think, writ large, who voted for him into the current administration. And so I think it's a couple of things. One question is people underestimate the complexity of the Latino vote in the United States and the issues that motivate that population of both native-born Latinas and Latinos, but also naturalized ones, is diverse not only across national origin, but also certainly across generation and class. And immigration policy is not the singular issue that motivates all of them. So that's one thing, I think.
Yeah.
Questions of religion, abortion, the economy, all of it is part and parcel of that conversation. And yes, some of it has to do with entrepreneurship and, business policies. But I think the other piece of it is the kind of quintessential problem of cangrejos, as we say in Mexico, right? And it's the question of both the generational question of, even if we look at Mexican migration and solidarity or lack of solidarity between different waves, Mexican migration has moved to be a much more Southern Mexico and indigenous migration flow. And frankly, folks who migrated 30, 40 years ago don't necessarily see themselves into those same
Mm-hmm.
populations,
Mm-hmm.
much less the Central American populations, and much less. And so this idea of Latino-Latina solidarity, I think, is over exaggerated. And even within certain populations, like the Mexican origin population, there's a whole host of other sets of politics animating, the Mexican American population in San Antonio, or the um, population in South Texas, which has been quite Republican, not just in terms of how they voted for the executive, but even local council members. So kind of thinking about them as like a full set of policies that are animating that, I think becomes really important. Um, and I think that
Absolutely.
if you poll, I would just, sorry to interrupt, but I think if you poll even a lot of undocumented folks, they actually are not the bastion of leftist liberal thinking that, we tend to assume them to be, right? Especially if they have fled um, uh, governments that they read to be dictatorial because of their leftist politics, so on and so forth. And so the way these homeland politics also get remade in the context of US politics, I think, are complicated, certainly in the current moment, especially with Venezuelans, but also in the past with Cubans, and even in the case of Mexicans. So.
I've spent many hours outside the IN, Instituto Nacional de Migración, in Mexico City, and a bit less in Guadalajara. In Mexico City, there are absolute ladies of the manor with Louis Vuitton bags
Hmm.
who do not think they should be in the line with me or anybody else because they say, soy Venezolana. And it's pretty clear that they don't have left liberal politics. They have money politics. And of course, there's been this shibboleth for an eternity in the Democratic Party that successive generations of Cubanas in South Florida will eventually turn away from the Republican Party and become
Hmm.
reliable Democrats. So I hear what you're saying. And of course, it's a problem too that all sorts of areas of US commercial life have had difficulty with. How do we pin down the
Hmm.
Latino-Latina market, right?
Hmm.
When people, as you say, can be of different color, different class, different language, all the rest of it. Um, Now, you mentioned labor, and
Hmm.
this is one of your principal areas of research. You look at issues relating to the interconnection of migration, labor, and law, amongst other things. You have a couple of pretty recent books out on these topics, one that's national and international, one that's a bit more regional. I wonder if you could talk to us about that work and where you see that heading. I'm thinking, uh, for example, of scaling migrant worker rights.
Hmm. Yeah, so thank you. And this is a good opportunity to acknowledge my colleague Xochitl Bada, who did this work with me, where we were particularly interested in doing a couple of things. One, moving the study of migration, especially in sociology, but more quintessentially, the discussion of immigration in the United States outside of just a domestic policy issue. I think there are few other places in the world where it is thought of that way, but this is a quintessential example of where the kind of scholarly field and the policy arena kind of have this feedback loop that think of it in this very insular way. And so we tend to, in the sociology of immigration, think about immigration as a domestic policy issue with some kind of discussion of transnational
Mm.
dynamics, but also we probably only until recently have started to kind of think about migration policy as part and parcel of bilateral relations and geopolitical conversations that are
Mm,
happening in the
mm,
United States. And so for us, this became important, especially if we started to try to understand state society relationships amongst Mexican migrants in the United States. Alejandra Delano, who is a political scientist at the New School, had done a lot of foundational work thinking about Mexico's shift towards its migrant population over time, from thinking of them as traders to having now programs that think about them as héroes and having entire programs like Bienvenido Paisano, which kind of think of them as emissaries of the nation
yep.
rather than and compatriots to which the Mexican government has an obligation. And so the specific program that we were interested in that book was the evolution of what went on to be the Binational Labor Rights Week, which came out of a set of labor accords post NAFTA that were negotiated to try to pin down what the obligation of the consular corps was in providing services and protection to migrant workers who we know are amongst the most vulnerable to workplace violations in the United States. So that was part of what we were interested in really focusing on migrant civil society in the United States and the role of the Mexican state in having to evolve around this new set of expectations on the part of diaspora, not only around expatriate voting rights or a whole host of other kind of key political issues, but also their obligation to Mexican migrants in the United States. And so part of this is a story of promise, and part of this is a story of kind of waning political will. This is a program that was started in 2008. Um, Primarily from the ground up, many migrant civil society groups that pushed through the IME and other kind of commissions and bodies that were in conversation with the foreign ministry in Mexico to kind of initiate a set of conversations and obligations between the federal labor standards enforcement agencies in the United States and the Secretaria in Mexico through this kind of 50 office consular corps. And so in places like Chicago, which had one of the first ventanillas laborales, we see these like on the ground efforts to try to not only educate migrants around their rights, but then also in some certain circumstances, try to provide material resources to help address things like wage theft, sexual harassment, discrimination. The second part of our question was acknowledging the deep divides in the United States between what the resources and the political will are to pull this off in a place like Chicago versus other consular offices spread out across the vast diaspora in the United States that were either smaller, less resourced, more rurally isolated, had to cover a larger jurisdiction, and face a different set of also state and local political challenges and realities. And so part of this is also kind of mapping the reality of Mexican civil society in the United States. Um, so that, I think that was the goal of that project. And it was also a foray into understanding this big gap between what we often call rights on the books and rights in practice. A lot of, I think,
Echa la ley, echa la
political
trampa.
a lot of ceremony around signing
Yep.
accords, even I think a lot of real political will, but little presupuesto and almost non-existent diplomatic authority to intervene. And so, but thinking about this as a springboard also for conversations between the labor movement in the United States and the labor movement in Mexico, which it was not lost on them, the irony of the Mexican government's newfound interest in supporting the rights of his diaspora that were engaged in sending remittances home, while at the same time actively ignoring its obligation to the labor movement at home. And so the latter part of the book thinks about kind of that distinction between the goals in Mexico um, towards its workers, but also the kind of shifting appetite away from not simply holding the Mexican government to account to the rights of its diaspora, these immigrants in the United States and in Canada, but also to the right to stay home. So, what are the obligations of the Mexican state to address the push
These
factors
things. Yeah.
in these places? Yeah.
It's interesting that the, in inverted commas, development sector or development industry started to fetishize remesas or remittances on the
Hmm.
grounds that they
Hmm.
were more effective than conventional state-based or NGO-based aid because they went very directly from one bank account to another, often in the
Hmm.
same family or sometimes in the same pueblo.
Hmm.
Another quick thing, just in case folks don't know, the prof mentioned NAFTA, which was North American Free Trade Agreement or Tratado de
Hmm.
Libre Comercio. And
Hmm.
it was initially Canada and the US from 1988. If I got that right, Prof, I think.
NAFTA was signed in 94, but
Yeah,
obviously they're kind of,
but its origins are with the
yep.
88 Canada
Hmm.
US.
Hmm. Hmm.
And
Hmm.
then
Hmm.
with Mexico, it takes effect January 1,
Yeah, yeah.
19.
Hmm.
Yeah. Um,
And
another,
now the USMCA, which is the kind of new incarnation, and it became the template for other free trade agreements in the region. Yeah.
and also stimulated extraordinary resistance in Mexico, particularly from the south, Chiapas, Oaxaca, these areas, the Zapatistas and others, as the inevitable pull of capitalism towards the big cities as a consequence of the erosion of an
Hmm.
agricultural way of life, made people, in addition to their marginalization for linguistic and ethnic reasons, take matters into their own hands against the Mexican state. So there's not only resistance at the great sucking sound, as it was called in
Hmm.
Congress, within the US, but also within Mexico itself, right?
Yeah, and it also, I think inspired both kind of these federal programs that had great PR around them, like the Tres por Uno and then Dos por Uno state level programs that would create these matching funds, but while still engaging in practices internally that were decimated agricultural sectors and were not doing much to actually raise the material reality of Mexico's workforce, over half of which is in the informal economy and not benefiting even from a lot of the reforms that we've recently seen. The other thing I would say is that the labor side accords that were attached to NAFTA became a template for a lot of what we later saw through Labor Rights Week. And while I think there's been plenty of criticism about the limits of those labor side accords as soft law that didn't really have much teeth binationally, they became really important. And this is the other part of the book for shaping impact litigation strategies on the part of transnational NGOs that were doing the work to kind of publicize not only the issues facing marginalized and unauthorized workers in the United States, but also the real challenges of the H-2A program, which has now been kind of heralded as this somehow magic fix to unauthorized migration, and the guest worker program, then the violations that end up being inherent in guest worker programs as well.
Now, your next book, which I have to confess I haven't read because I was able to get that one free because it's available
Yes, we tried.
artists to download, which is really
Hmm.
great. But the
Hmm.
next one is about Houston. And Houston is very important where I live in Guadalajara, and very
Hmm.
important for the people who run the place where I work, who are in Monterrey. I work at
Hmm.
Patek.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
in Monterrey, vast numbers of people work in what they call Macallen, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And lots in Houston.
Hmm.
And it's a very present absence and an absent presence in Mexican life in
Hmm.
the Central West and the Northwest. And of
Hmm.
course, it also incarnates in its eponym a moment in aggravated relations between Mexico and the United States.
Hmm. Yeah, so the next book, though not the most recent book, is a collaboration with a colleague, Els de Graaf, who's my longtime collaborator and political scientist at the City University of New York, where we kind of used Houston as an entry point to reframing how we think about U.S. immigration politics and centering the importance of local politics around issues not only of immigration enforcement, which has increasingly been relevant since the mid-1990s, where the 287G policies that were created through federal policy were kind of seeded, but then also immigrant integration policies. And yes, I want to acknowledge that Houston and Monterrey have a really important connection. Ruben Hernandez Leon has a great book on metropolitan migrants, which kind of really digs into this relationship that the Regios have with Houston and the Valley. But it's also, many other books have a really important focus on the specific financial investments on the northern part of the Mexican in northern part of the country and along the border that end up having these deep relationships with Monterrey. In advancing immigrant rights in Houston, it's a little book. It's only 35,000 words. It's part actually of a series published by Temple University Press that's called Political Lessons in U.S. Cities. And it's a really kind of fun um, idea where you take a city, a US city, and you try to tell a story through that city and through a particular policy. And so we did this using immigration, and we focus on a few different substantive areas within immigration, including the Mayoral Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs, which has taken on a number of different names over the years, enforcement policies with both Harris County and the Houston Police Department, questions around wage theft enforcement, and also the work of local nonprofits in particular in the wake of the announcement around DACA and the deferred action for parents of Americans, which ultimately was struck down. And so we use this kind of as a way in to understand the importance of municipal politics and the complexities, what I wanted to say about Houston, of places that are not easily slotted into leftist or right leaning politics. This is a real, what we call kind of purple or hybrid space. Houston is also, people may not realize, the most demographically diverse city in the country. And while Mexicans form a huge part of that, many other places do as well. Next to New York, it's one of the largest consular cores. And just like geographically, it's kind of mirrors places like LA where it just sprawls and sprawls. And so um, it makes for a really interesting kind of urban sociology examination of immigration politics in a hard to define place. It is, yes, a city, but overlaps with a dozen counties and other jurisdictions and has a lot of surrounding suburban communities, bedroom communities that kind of shape the politics of migration politics, not always in leftist ways. And so it's a complex place.
It sounds like a great series, Temple University Press.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So
Now, some
there's
listeners may be unfamiliar with the concept of wage theft, Prof. Could you explain that? Well, they may have experienced it without having
mhm,
a name for it. Could you
yeah.
explain that a wee bit?
Yeah, I'll explain it and also critique the term a bit. I think law scholars and others who study the term use it because it's the kind of popular way that advocates have often taken on the term. And the essential assumption is that we tend to think about theft and burglary, for example, in terms of how a police unit might approach the issue as being kind of material goods. But in many cases, you have theft happening in terms of the individual labor that is being generated by workers across the country. There are federal, state, and local laws that govern the minimum hourly wage. So in some places there's a state wage, and in some places there's even a local wage. And there are agencies attached to those statutes that are meant to kind of ensure that employers abide by not only what the minimum wage is, but also questions around overtime and a whole host of other things, including kind of rest and meal breaks, et cetera. Okay, so the idea of wage theft is when an employer fails to comply with those rules, and more importantly, when there are very um, little incentives for them to comply, either because they see it as the cost of doing business, the likelihood that they're going to get actually reported or penalized is very low, and or the industry demand for them to lower the labor costs is increasingly high, like in residential construction. Like, why wouldn't they do that?
Yeah.
In most of the country, we have a very claims-driven process. So the only way this is going to get held to an employer is going to be held to account is if someone files a claim. And for lots of different reasons, that is harder for certain workers, including immigrants. Now, the reason I waffle a little bit in terms of wage theft is that it's not always necessarily an intentional act, but it doesn't mean that it is um, any less harmful act in terms of the wages of folks. And so because the practice of wage theft has so deeply been inculcated into different industry practices, it often is overlooked as kind of a benign act. But whether or not, and so the question of intentionality I think is besides the point, whether or not either a large corporation or even a small business owner intends to undercut their workers doesn't mean that there's not a still material impact on their living. The federal minimum wage in the United States is completely unlivable, I would say, anywhere. It's 7.25, and it can only change by congressional um, statute, and the Fair Labor Standards Act just hasn't adjusted to that. In other places, it's far higher, and in some places, you have a dual standard, depending if you're in upstate New York or downstate New York. Undocumented immigrants are eligible for the most part for all labor protections, and employers don't get an out just because someone is unauthorized to work, whether they know it or not. But the biggest question is whether or not unauthorized workers have access points to be able to bring their complaints about wage theft, certainly to a federal agency, but also to a whole host of other agencies that are also tasked with ensuring that they are protected. There's lots of different reasons why they wouldn't do that, especially in places where the same building that is tasked with enforcing your labor standards is adjacent to the one that's established to identify and deport you. So a lot of the book was trying to understand what are the ways in which labor advocates have created alternatives to help shepherd those claims through the system. And wage theft becomes kind of a starting point to understand a whole host of other things that workers might be experiencing that require redress.
Now, on the website, Prof, and I'll provide a link to it in the notes accompanying the publication of the podcast, there is another co-authored book with a number of authors listed as forthcoming, I think. Now, that can mean many things. It could mean tomorrow, it could mean in 2 years. But
Yeah,
to the extent that marketing desire, oh my God, okay, sorry.
it's a thing now. It
It's
is
in
a
your
thing
very
now.
hands. Now, unfortunately,
Yeah,
people won't see that because, as you
yeah,
can tell, I'm not wearing concealer. So with the
yeah.
invested to me by Patriarch, I'm going to transform this into an MP3 file. But my God, there it is.
It
Tell
is
us
here.
about the brand new shiny object, Prof.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm just going to keep singing the praises of my co-authors. This is probably the culmination of kind of what collaboration can really mean in interdisciplinary spaces. So the new book is published by Russell Sage Foundation Press, based in New York City. And this was a project that emerged in collaboration with the lead author, Katie Griffith, who is a law scholar interested in the intersection of immigration and labor policy. And we really went into it with a long-standing interest we both had about the ways in which immigration policy really foils the ability to enforce labor standards in the United States. Um, Increasingly, I don't have to tell anyone who's been paying attention in the United States, the workplace has become one of the major targets of immigration enforcement, but that actually was created almost 40 years ago through a much more mundane mechanism called the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which created a process of employment verification that we've all um, become familiar with through the signing of the I-9 document that we all have to fill out in order to get legal work access in the United States. And before 1986, employers were not tasked with having to do that screening, and now they are subject to fine and penalty if they don't. And so this has created this deep bureaucratic system of surveillance that has allowed not only the large scale raids that we've seen all over the news, but also the long, slow bureaucratic auditing that was actually quite effective during the Obama administration. So the way we came into this project was to try to understand how that immigration policy space was impacting not only undocumented, but also temp folks with temporary work authorization. And the quintessential group that we started with was those with temporary protected status, another kind of longstanding program that's been under threat that has benefited more recently Ukrainians and Venezuelans. But prior to that, the two largest groups were Salvadorans and Haitians. And so we wanted to understand how immigration policy has this spillover effect. And so the book itself walks readers through three parts to try to understand how not only labor policy impacts the precarity of low-wage workers, but also immigration policy. And through understanding the experiences very specifically of Haitian and Central American workers in New York City and the surrounding metropolitan area, we were able to also think through how the long um, legacies of racial inequality and colonial histories also impacts the experiences that those migrant workers are having even in the United States, and how it shapes their own understandings about their unequal experiences and the narratives that they tell about their position of belonging in the United States. The other key thing that this book really highlights is twofold. One is the importance of dignity in the experiences that workers are having. As a labor scholar, a lot of what I engage is Bureau of Labor Statistics surveys that kind of mark all sorts of questions about the material reality of workers, wages, occupational prestige, so on and so forth. But what gets lost in kind of traditional studies is people's experiences of dignity and undignified conditions and lack of respect, and those interpersonal relationships with their employers, but also their coworkers, their patients, their customers, and how that sense of autonomy really shaped their sense of self at the workplace. The other thing that we really wanted to capture was how workers were pushing back and creating a sense of agency even outside of these formal government processes. There's a formal government process to file a claim, but just because someone doesn't go through that process, we really wanted to understand how they were carving out for themselves a sense of autonomy, even with a really constrained set of realities. So that's what the book looks at, and I commend it to those who can access it. And to kind of commend the cover art. People can't see it, but if you go to the website, is of a really fantastic Venezuelan artist who's worked with the National Day Labor Organizing Network, and we're really privileged to be able to use his art.
Legalized inequalities. Now, Prof, here's a methodological question. You've already outed yourself as a presentist who doesn't know how to turn the lights on at the library, Cornell. But so how do you find things out? What do you do?
I have been to the library. We have many libraries on campus. But I think, this is again a testament to collaborative work. It's also a testament to working with really brilliant research assistants and graduate students. I think as you move through the kind of rungs of academia, there can be um, a tendency to kind of exist in an echo chamber, and it does create some need for effort to actually help you kind of push into a more expansive space. And so I have tried to do my best to kind of move outside of that. And so working collaboratively both with research colleagues as well as research assistants, I think has been helpful.
And working with quite a few lawyers slash professors of law, you've published in some law journals, for example. What's it like doing that? Is that a different sort of enterprise from publishing in a sociology place?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the key questions in law journals are the doctrinal implications of, changing laws and policies, and in those spaces, I often defer to my colleague Kate Griffith, who's a law scholar. Um, my running joke, and my co-author won't mind if I say that, is that the the rigor with which my law colleagues approach data is leaves a lot to be desired. So the sociologist in me is interested a lot, not only in the kind of theoretical interventions, but also the kind of empirical rigor of the data, argumentation as it relates to social theory, but also like what is the evidence and how do we create both qualitative and quantitative data approaches that help us interrogate not only the premise, but also the counterfactual and kind of set a standard of conversations that can apply beyond the specific case study. Whereas I think the law is often interested in not only the doctrinal implications for that particular case, but also the broader implications for that area, for example, of administrative law. A lot of immigration ends up being much, relevant for a whole host of other admin law areas. So, yeah.
Now, there's a word I don't think we've used, the C word, citizenship.
Mhm.
Renato Rosaldo, renowned poet and anthropologist, is maybe the Fons et Origo of the concept of cultural citizenship. It's such a complex, open technology, the idea of citizenship. What part does it play in your thinking? What part does it play in the thinking of some of the activists and other groups you've worked with?
So I think citizenship carries a couple of different meanings. I think one obviously is the legalistic meaning of citizenship in terms of a political category of belonging that has a set of rights and obligations ascribed to it.
Mm.
That's kind of the more bureaucratic way of thinking about it in the context of immigration, but also citizenship means more broadly belonging. And a lot of the work that sociologists have done thinking about citizenship also invokes the question of social citizenship and the obligation that the state has to even to its citizenry, right? And so if we think about educational rights, social welfare rights, et cetera, um, I think citizenship typically is studied from a top-down perspective, kind of a state-centric perspective, but increasingly humanities scholars and those certainly in cultural studies have thought about kind of citizenship as an active process of meaning making from even marginalized groups themselves. And so how do you create forms of belonging? I'm mostly interested in citizenship as this kind of clear demarcation between, as Linda Bosniak refers to it, the citizen and the alien. So all the work that we do to kind of define the confines of the interior, who's accepted in terms of citizenship. So even all these conversations we're having right now about birthright citizenship in the 14th Amendment, I think missed the point because just as we are discussing who should be excluded, we are very actively naming and very explicitly recently pointing to who we think we are, right? Which is um, in many cases a white-centric nation that excludes the vast majority of the other diasporas that have come to define the United States. And so to me, citizenship becomes a foil again for how do we think about the bounds of not only nation or nationhood, but also exclusion and inferiority. So it's an active process of marginalizing the other so that we can define the subject.
I remember when I took a citizenship test to become a gringo, one of the questions was which countries won the Second World War? And the only correct answer, there were 100 questions. You could be asked any 10 on the day. You had to get at least 6 right. The only correct answer to this was America, England, excluding Britain, and France. Now, Mexico fought in the Second World War on behalf of the Allies. So did China. something like 25 million Soviet citizens fought in the war against fascism. But France, which last I saw was packing Jews and others off in trains to be slaughtered, in fact, helped to win the war. One of the other questions was, what did Dwight D. Eisenhower do prior to becoming president? The correct answer would have been he was president of Columbia University, but no, he was supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe. So for me, there is certainly this whiteness element you talk about, but there's also a deeply militaristic one.
And today's a really interesting day to have that conversation, given that Hegseth is having a gathering of military leaders right now, I think, as a way to kind of rethink um, U.S. position and the role in of the president in shaping that. And so, yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, political scientists have looked at this question of, as it relates back to migration, the war of kind of the role of war, the role of militarization, both in terms of shaping migration policy. We see this in terms of the sending of the National Guard down to the southern border, but we also see the ways in which migration itself gets mobilized as a trope to help justify the need for militarization itself. This was, I think, nowhere more true recently since 9/11, right, where we kind of generated all sorts of questions and motivations around the enemy, not only in outside our borders, but in our midst. The 2002 Registration Act that rounded people up and who fit a particular criteria of South Asian or Arab and Muslim men. Right. And so I don't think we can talk about migration history or migration policy outside of the broader geopolitics and specifically the militarized engagements that we have that are creating diasporas, but then also being actively those engagements are being actively kind of in some ways even fought by those the not only the children of that diaspora, but some of those migrants themselves. The work of my colleague Sophia Aptekar looks at the role of immigrants in the military. But it also, there's this kind of constant looming threat of who is America, and the need to kind of defend that, I think becomes really salient to the American public.
And Prof S, I have one more question for you, if I may. And then after that, as a means of bringing things to a close, I'd like to give you the opportunity to add anything you may wish. That could be revisiting something we've already discussed, or it could be entirely new material, something we haven't touched on. Does that sound okay as a means of concluding matters?
Yeah. And I think that I think what becomes really important in the current moment is to um, start to think intellectually through not only the lens of U.S. academic, and I'm saying speaking from the perspective of an academic, not only from thinking interdisciplinary within academia, but start to read and be in conversation with folks beyond the U.S. I have found even just in the space of immigration, how productive it is to talk to scholars who are in Latin America or even just specifically in Mexico. The questions, the assumptions, the political goals are vastly different in many cases. And so I think that's just being a resident of the hegemon. It's very easy to not do that. And it's a privilege that the rest of the world doesn't get to have. Everyone else has to make sure they're engaged with us. And so that's, I think, an active responsibility that we have as thinkers. So
And
thank you.
I think that relates really well to where we began when you talked about trying not to be too caught up in the higher education crisis of the United States right now. So thank you so much for your
Thank you, Toby.
generosity.
I really appreciate it. I have to run, but I hope to that our paths cross in the future. So take care.
Happy day.
Bye.